4 years before the world would come to know the name San Juanico through fire and destruction, the neighborhood of San Juan Ixhuatepec existed quietly on the edges of Mexico City, a patchwork of brick homes, narrow alleys and small markets, alive with ordinary rhythms of life that hid extraordinary danger. Each morning, families rose before dawn. Fathers and older sons embarked on long journeys to factories, construction sites and industrial workshops, carrying the weight of responsibility for households whose survival depended on daily labor. Mothers prepared breakfast over gas stoves fueled by the very liquefied petroleum gas that would one day become a weapon of destruction. Children ran through narrow streets tangled with electrical wires and street markets, their laughter and play juxtaposed against the looming presence of massive steel spheres that stored tens of thousands of tons of highly combustible LPG. These tanks, symbols of industrial might, had become a silent part of daily life. Visible from rooftops, present in conversations, yet ignored not out of recklessness, but because the residents had grown accustomed to them. Warning signs posted along fences and pipelines faded into the scenery. The plant was background noise, a feature of the environment, its dangers abstract, distant, and seemingly manageable. The facility itself was considered critical infrastructure. Operated by PEMEX, it was part of the lifeblood of Mexico City's energy system. The plant was a carefully engineered marvel, a testament to industrial ambition, yet its proximity to densely populated neighborhoods created a fragile balance between production and peril. Engineers understood the risks. LPG is extremely volatile, heavier than air, and capable of igniting explosively with the smallest spark if improperly contained. International guidelines prescribed strict buffer zones, minimum distances between tanks and rigorous emergency procedures. Yet those guidelines often clashed with the reality of growing demand. As Mexico City expanded, more storage tanks were added, pipelines crisscrossed the neighborhood, and emergency systems were not upgraded to match the increased density of fuel. Safety reports were drafted, recommendations were made, but they were absorbed into bureaucracy, diluted by cost-cutting and undermined by the comforting absence of previous disasters. Years of complacency and incremental expansion had created the perfect conditions for catastrophe. A ticking clock invisible to those who walked safely beside it every day. On the morning of November 19, 1984, that invisible threat revealed itself. In the early hours around 5:30 a.m., routine operations were underway at the facility. A transfer pipeline, carrying highly pressurized LPG from one tank to another, failed. Whether due to overpressure, mechanical fatigue, or a combination of both, the rupture released an enormous quantity of liquefied gas into the atmosphere. Immediately, the gas began to vaporize, expanding hundreds of times its original volume. Unlike lighter-than-air natural gas, the LPG flowed along the ground, creeping into low areas, seeping under doors and collecting in courtyards. The invisible clouds spread outward, heavier than the morning air, silently infiltrating homes where people still slept. The seconds stretched into minutes. Critical minutes in which evacuation might have been possible, in which alarms could have triggered automatic shutoffs, but no decisive action occurred. Inside the plant, warning systems either failed or were ignored. Workers struggled to assess the magnitude of the leak as time slipped by, while the neighborhoods surrounding the plant remained oblivious to the silent killer that had begun to gather at their feet. By approximately 5:44 a.m., the invisible became instant and undeniable. Ignition occurred, likely from a spark, a vehicle engine, or an exposed flame, and the first explosion ripped through the neighborhood. The night was obliterated in a fraction of a second. A fireball shot skyward, visible for miles, its brilliance eclipsing the early morning light. The shockwave flattened houses nearest the tanks, shattered windows kilometers away, and sent steel fragments hurling through the air. People closest to the blast were vaporized. Those a little farther away were thrown like rag dolls against walls and vehicles, or crushed beneath the weight of collapsing roofs. Others were engulfed by flames so hot that clothing and skin fused, igniting in seconds. Windows became molten, doors twisted as if made of paper. Concrete cracked and shattered under the heat and force. The sound of the blast, an unrelenting roar, drowned all other noise. Cries, alarms, and traffic were obliterated in the immediacy of death. The first blast was only the beginning. The heat from the initial explosion engulfed nearby storage tanks, raising internal pressures until the steel spheres could no longer contain the expanding LPG. One by one, tanks failed in a cascading sequence of boiling liquid expanding vapor explosions or bleaves. Each detonation unleashed fireballs larger than the last, each hurling fragments of steel weighing thousands of kilograms across streets, homes, and yards. Vehicles were sliced in half. Trees were stripped bare of leaves and branches. Entire walls crumbled as if paper thin. The explosions came in unpredictable waves, interspersed with moments of horrifying calm that tricked survivors into thinking the worst had passed, only to be thrown back into chaos when the next blast erupted without warning. For almost 2 hours, San Juanico remained a war zone. Firefighters from across Mexico City arrived only to find a scene impossible to penetrate. The heat was unbearable. Water was ineffective against flames fueled by thousands of tons of LPG. Secondary explosions made every approach a gamble with life. Residents who had fled were trapped in streets transformed into ovens, forced to navigate rubble, flaming debris, and the bodies of their neighbors. Smoke and toxic gases filled the air, searing lungs and leaving survivors barely able to breathe. Those who inhaled deeply suffered fatal internal burns even if their skin appeared untouched. The chaos was compounded by the lack of communication systems, poor coordination among emergency responders, and the sheer unpredictability of the cascading explosions, creating a nightmare scenario where every second was a fight for survival. Hospitals in Mexico City became overrun almost immediately. Ambulances arrived faster than patients could be admitted or triaged. Doctors and nurses, many unprepared for mass casualty events of this scale, were forced into impossible decisions. Who could be saved, who should receive priority, and who, by all measures, was already lost. Children arrived burned beyond recognition. Elderly residents who could not escape in time suffered severe injuries. Supplies, dressing, fluids, pain relief ran out within hours. Blood banks were depleted. Corridors filled with groaning victims and frantic relatives, creating an atmosphere of desperate chaos rarely seen outside wartime zones. Medical staff who had trained for emergencies were confronted with the unimaginable scale of suffering, decisions that would haunt them for years afterward. As the morning sunlight finally pierced the smoke and ash, the full extent of the disaster in San Juanico became horrifyingly visible. What had once been a bustling neighborhood, a labyrinth of narrow streets, small markets, and cinderblock homes painted in bright colors, was now almost unrecognizable. Entire blocks had been leveled, leaving behind jagged remnants of walls and foundations. Craters marked the spots where homes, schools, shops, and local churches had once stood, the ground scorched and littered with molten metal, twisted steel, and the charred remains of possessions that spoke of lives abruptly ended. Vehicles had been reduced to blackened husks, some embedded in concrete or impaled by steel fragments that flew like missiles during the explosions. Trees, street signs, and utility poles had been stripped bare, their skeletal frames silhouetted against smoke-filled skies, eerily silent in a landscape that had once been alive with morning chatter. Steel fragments and pieces of industrial equipment were scattered for kilometers, embedded into the walls and roofs of structures that had miraculously survived the blast. The shapes of these objects, contorted by heat and force, looked almost sculptural in their grotesque artistry, a testament to the raw power unleashed that morning. Even the air itself was heavy with lingering heat, a suffocating mixture of smoke, vaporized chemicals, and ash that coated every surface, clinging to hair, skin, and lungs. The smell of burning plastic, metal, and flesh hung in the streets, overwhelming anyone who dared approach the devastation. Walking through the ruins, survivors and responders were confronted with scenes that seemed unreal, as though the normal rules of space and time had been violently rewritten. Streets, once crowded with vendors and children playing, were now paths lined with bodies. Neighbors, friends, and family, some hastily covered with blankets, others exposed, burned beyond recognition, or dismembered by the blast and flying debris. The human toll was staggering. Entire families had vanished, leaving behind nothing but charred remnants of furniture, scorched clothing, and the eerie silence of homes once full of life. Some residents who had survived were already wandering in shock, searching desperately for missing loved ones among the ruins, often stumbling across scenes too horrific to describe, their cries swallowed by the vastness of destruction. The official death toll, released in the immediate aftermath, recorded several hundred fatalities, yet even at the time it was widely understood that these numbers represented only a fraction of the true human cost. Undocumented residents, migrant workers, children not yet registered in local records, and entire households that had lived together for generations were missing from official counts. Many of these families had no formal documentation. Their existence had been informal and invisible to government registries. Independent estimates suggested that the number of lives lost could reach into the thousands. Entire generations wiped out in a single morning of fire and chaos, leaving behind a void in families, schools, and communities that could never be filled. The physical devastation mirrored a psychological and emotional one. Survivors described the streets as surreal, almost dreamlike, littered with memories frozen in fire. Toys melted into grotesque shapes. Photographs and documents charred beyond recognition. Kitchens, once the heart of family life, reduced to blackened ruins. The local schoolyard where children had played the day before was now a crater, scorched earth strewn with personal belongings and shattered furniture. The air seemed suspended in time, as if the world had paused in mourning for what had been lost. Amid this desolation, emergency crews and volunteers worked frantically, yet even their presence highlighted the scale of impossibility. The forces unleashed by the explosions had erased the distinction between human effort and natural law. Ordinary heroism seemed almost meaningless against the magnitude of destruction. In addition to human casualties, the disaster left a staggering environmental impact. LPG explosions produced thick black smoke, contaminating air quality across the city. Burned chemicals and industrial debris seeped into soil and waterways, leaving long-term hazards for those who returned to rebuild. Water sources became contaminated with fuel residues and ash. Streets remained impassable for days as molten metal cooled into jagged, sharp landscapes. For weeks, the smell of burned fuel lingered in the air, a constant, inescapable reminder of the disaster. Wildlife, too, suffered. Birds and domestic animals perished in the fires, while livestock in the surrounding areas were killed or rendered unusable. San Juanico was erased not in a single instant, but through hours of relentless, unimaginable fire. Each explosion, each secondary blast, compounded the destruction, tearing away not just structures, but also the very sense of community, security, and normalcy. By the time emergency services could even begin meaningful search and rescue, the damage had been so extensive that silence dominated the neighborhood. The streets that had once echoed with children's laughter and the sounds of daily life were now marked by an absence so profound it could almost be felt physically. The absence of families, of familiar voices, of routines, of everything ordinary that had defined the neighborhood before that fateful morning. San Juanico had not merely been destroyed. It had been transformed into a monument to loss, its ruins a permanent testament to the devastating combination of industrial failure, human vulnerability, and systemic negligence. In the days that followed the explosions, San Juanico became a landscape of mourning and disorientation, where time itself seemed to fracture under the weight of loss. Survivors moved through hospitals, morgues, and improvised shelters in a state of suspended disbelief, clutching scraps of paper with names written in shaking hands, scanning rows of burned bodies and lists taped to walls, hoping for recognition and fearing it at the same time. Many never found answers. Entire families had vanished without a trace, their homes reduced to ash, their identities erased in fire so intense that nothing remained to bury. Funerals unfolded continuously, day after day, often without coffins, often without certainty, as priests and relatives spoke prayers over remains that could not be definitively named. In some cases, mass graves became the only option, not out of neglect but necessity, as the scale of death overwhelmed both ritual and record-keeping, leaving grief unresolved and permanent. As the immediate shock faded, anger began to surface, quiet at first, then increasingly vocal. Survivors asked questions that had no comforting answers. Why the plant had been allowed to operate so close to homes, why warnings from workers had gone unheeded, why emergency systems failed so completely, and why evacuation never came. The government responded swiftly, deploying military units to secure the area, controlling access to the site, and prioritizing the restoration of order and infrastructure. Public messaging focused on resilience, unity, and reconstruction, while discussions of negligence, regulatory failure, and accountability were carefully softened. Official investigations acknowledged mechanical and procedural failures but framed them as technical misfortunes rather than systemic negligence, avoiding personal responsibility within PEMEX or government oversight bodies. Compensation programs were announced, but distribution was uneven and often insufficient, leaving many survivors to rebuild their lives with minimal support, deepening mistrust and reinforcing the sense that justice had been deferred, if not denied. For those who lived through the disaster, survival itself became a long-term burden. Thousands carried severe burns that required years of treatment, multiple surgeries, and lifelong medical care that many could not afford. Children grew up marked by scars that shaped how the world treated them and how they saw themselves. Psychological trauma lingered in ways that were less visible but no less destructive. Nightmares, panic triggered by the smell of gas, the sound of sirens, or the sudden flare of light in the early morning hours. Entire families were reshaped by absence. Parents without children, children without parents. While the community struggled to reconcile the need to move forward with the impossibility of forgetting. Beyond Mexico's borders, however, San Juanico forced a reckoning within the global industrial and engineering community. The disaster shattered long-held assumptions about LPG storage safety, particularly the belief that worst-case scenarios were too improbable to justify extensive preventive investment. Engineers, regulators, and risk analysts dissected the event in unprecedented detail, recognizing it as the deadliest liquefied petroleum gas accident in history and one of the most severe industrial disasters ever recorded. The cascading beliefs observed at San Juanico transformed theoretical models into documented reality, demonstrating with brutal clarity how inadequate tank spacing, insufficient pressure relief systems, and poor emergency response integration could convert a single leak into a multi-hour catastrophe. As a result, international safety standards were fundamentally revised. Tank layouts were redesigned to increase separation distances. Automatic shutoff and pressure relief mechanisms became mandatory rather than optional. Hazard zoning laws were strengthened to prevent residential encroachment near high-risk facilities. Emergency response planning began to emphasize worst-case, low-probability events rather than average operating conditions. From Europe to Asia, San Juanico entered textbooks, safety manuals, and regulatory hearings, not as an abstract lesson, but as a warning etched into global industrial memory. Lives were saved elsewhere because of what was lost in San Juanico, even as that truth offered limited comfort to those who had paid the price. Today, decades later, San Juanico stands rebuilt but never restored. New homes occupy old ground, yet the memory of what happened lingers beneath the surface, passed down through stories, silences, and anniversaries marked not on calendars but in bodies and minds. Survivors still recall the sound of the explosions with terrifying clarity, describing it not as a noise but as a force that entered the chest and never fully left. The site of the plant remains a symbol, of modernity unchecked, of warnings ignored, of the human cost of institutional complacency. And the disaster endures as a lasting indictment of how industrial catastrophes are born. Not in a single moment of failure, but through years of decisions that normalize risk, defer responsibility, and place efficiency above life, until one ordinary morning becomes irreversible history, and an entire community learns, too late, the true cost of being invisible to power.